Hello and welcome to The Print. I'm Snehesh. In good news, the Air Force has come out with its latest doctrine. Now, what is a doctrine? What does the latest 2023 doctrine really say? What is it all about? Has the Air Force learned lessons from the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, where the mighty Russian Air Force has actually failed? Uh, does the Air Force take lessons from what our immediate neighbors are doing, which is Pakistan, and more importantly, China, which focuses a lot on air power? And to discuss these issues, I have with me Air Marshal Diptendu Choudhury. He is one of the architects of this new Indian Air Force doctrine that has been put out for public consumption. So, welcome to the print, sir.
Thank you very much, Sneh. It's always a pleasure to be back with you. And I won't, when you say I'm an architect of the doctrine, that will be an overstatement because it's been there's a team of very fine young Air Force minds who have been at work with it. And I've just helped them along the way.
Absolutely. And that is why I said one of the architects and one of the key architect is what I would say.
Thank you.
So to begin with, what is the Indian Air Force doctrine?
Sneh, it's interesting that you mentioned that because I think all the services do have a doctrine. But I think it's the IAF which has been revising its doctrine on a fairly regular basis because the first one came out in 1995. And in fact, post-Kargil war, that's the time we realized that this is something which needs to be put out in the common domain. And I think in 2012, it was put out in the common domain. And this is the third iteration of the doctrine. So doctrine is simply an overview. Now we have unclassified and classified doctrines. Classified doctrine is obviously within the service, which I'm sure all the services have. But it's an unclassified doctrine which the Air Force has taken the initiative to put out, simply to put across to the nation what the India's aerospace power is all about. So that's why I think this doctrine is quite important and timely.
Okay. So when you say there is a classified doctrine, there's an unclassified doctrine. So the Air Force, which has put out is the unclassified doctrine. There is also a classified doctrine, which probably will go much deeper into tactics, operations planning.
Absolutely, Sneh. What happens is aerospace power, in fact, today is essentially a complex business. And in fact, most non-practitioners have a tough time figuring it out, simply because air power, or I'll say aerospace power, as it is called today, is an extremely technology-driven service. And, with rapid changes in development in military technology, the Air Force keeps changing. And with every change in technology, it brings in new capabilities, new capacities. And because of which, the Air Force has had to consistently, and in fact, all the Air Forces do in the world over, to change their tactics, their doctrines, their strategies, apace with the technological changes. So, but 10 years is roughly the ballpark time which the Indian Air Force has been changing its doctrine. The other services do probably have, I don't know, I'm not aware if they have an unclassified doctrine in the open domain, but the Navy has, I think for sure. But it's important to put this unclassified doctrine out, which is a very concise and focused version of the classified doctrine, simply to tell the policymakers, to bureaucrats, to the strategic community, to the security establishment, to academia, to the media, and most certainly to the aware citizens of what aerospace power is all about and where does it fit into the national construct in terms of national security and national interests.
So, you mentioned that two doctrines. And what exactly does this doctrine really say, the one that has been put out for public consumption? And importantly, you mentioned that there's also aimed not just at the public, but also the policymakers. So my natural question would be, why do you want the policymakers to read this? I thought the policymakers would already be aware of the Air Force doctrine, or what the Air Force is capable of or not capable of.
So the point here is, like I was mentioning earlier, since the doctrine itself has changed over the years and it's matured over the years and kept pace with technology, there are a lot of capabilities and what where the Air Force fits in as an aerospace power in today's national security and regional geopolitical construct is probably much more than what it was in the past. And precisely that is the reason why, there needs to be a sort of a refresher of, if I may say, of what are the doctrinal precepts and of what the IS is capable of. And so this doctrine is a very a comprehensive document. I mean, it right from the vision, Air Force vision and core values. It talks about nature of aerospace power and how it fits into the national overall national construct and with the national security. And it talks about the evolving aerospace objectives and of the what the Indian Air Force is really capable of offering to the nation in the larger perspective of national security and interests, not necessarily always security, because Air Force does have a huge non-kinetic soft power aspect, which does play into national interests in many ways. And then there is also about the S strategy, that how does the Air Force go about its business during peace, during no war, no peace periods, and as well as during wartime. And then there is also this aspect that of what does aerospace power, how does it fit into the Indian context, in the larger Indian context, and not necessarily probably from a security perspective. And also it lays out a sort of a roadmap for future. How should the aerospace power trajectory be in the future, in the national perspective.
So when you talk about air power during the peace tenure, we understand. During the war times, we understand. But what is this no peace, no war scenario? And
now this is terminology. I'm sure you're all aware because the media also uses it extensively.
I was asking for the viewers, on behalf of the viewers.
Okay, so it sort of describes a period of a political military construct where the nation is fundamentally at peace, but like it classically in India's case, we have this proxy sponsored terrorism. There is this conflict. There is this external border conflict which sort of keeps recurring at regular intervals. There are some internal security issues, and how the geopolitics internationally plays out into the larger security issue as well. And today we all talk about economics, as a tool, economics as a tool of warfare worldwide. So point is, we as India, as a nation, we are all the viewers, I'm sure, are aware, we are at a very different construct compared to most other countries, because we have two adversaries and our issues with them are pretty alive and ongoing and not likely to disappear in a hurry. So this no war, no peace construct covers this aspect, that what does air power do in this period, in this intergenum, in this interim period? How does air power strategy play out? So basically, it looks at both two extremes. One is avoid war, push away war, and transit to peace. So in between, in this construct, we have a lot of integrated aspects which goes on, like ISR carries on, information warfare carries on. There are shaping operations where rapid mobility, deterrence, these are factors which play out and which is like it played out in the Galwan crisis, the way air power rapidly built up. Now this was not really in war circumstances, nor was it peaceful circumstances. So things like that, and influencing operations, then capability demonstrations. When we display a kind of new military capability, or we carry out exercise in the larger Indo-Pacific construct, take part in the Malabar exercises. So these are all sort of assist in shaping the environment. And on the other side, in between, we have this external security circumstances where there is air defense which carries on throughout 24/7, 365 days in a year. Absolutely. It's something which people take for granted. Because right as we speak, there are Air Force radars churning. There are bases which are on standby. There are pilots, there are aircraft on readiness, and which scramble on a regular basis to intercept on any violations or even deviations of civil aviation, civil aircraft. And these activities carry on throughout the peacetime. And also you have this internal security operations where air power assists significantly in ISR activities in recce and surveillance, and also during calamities and contingencies where air power rapidly, let's say for example, any disaster, moving the NDRF teams are the responsibility of the Indian Air Force. So rapidly, within hours it moves. So all this comes into the no war, no peace construct.
Okay. So, one question would come to mind is that India now is moving on to the theaterization process. It's all about integration of the three services. It's about dividing the entire thing into various theaters. You'll have the air defense, you'll have the northern theater, something to look after the western theater. So, in this, where does this IAF doctrine really come about? Is the IAF still thinking from a unilateral point of view, or where does IAF fit into the whole picture, sir?
I'll start with the last word you mentioned, from a unilateral point of view. So IAF is never thought from a unilateral point of view, because I want to make it very clear to the people around that the Indian Air Force has always fought alongside with the Army and the Navy. And that has so been its role all through. In fact, all the joint constructs that we have in sort of institutions that we have amongst other services, it's the Air Force which has advanced headquarters with the Army, with the Navy. So the Air Force is very clear that it has a large role to play in assisting the other services in wartime for their objectives and for their military objectives. But the point here is that now we are looking at warfare in an integrated manner, where we are bringing together all the three services to a larger military objective, which sort of feeds into the larger political objectives. So that is where the integration has been looked at from a larger theater perspective. While the word theater perspective, there have been probably some reservations from the Air Force, but that has got nothing to do with integration and coming together as a military instrument. It is more about the theater per se, as it is presently viewed, is seen from a continental perspective and a maritime perspective. Whereas you will appreciate air power, and like so in the world over, is a vertical domain. It occupies an invisible space. But there are clear constructs of national sovereignty in terms of airspace as well, over our country and our island territories as well. So air power has been deeply embedded and integrated with other services jointly right through in all its wars. In fact, the 1971 and 79, there was a huge amount of close integration with the two services. But the only challenge lies is that when you look at it from a continental perspective, our threats in the borders, our construct is that we will defend our territory. India has no ambitions to capture territory, to move into somebody else's territory, but most certainly very firmly and resolutely defend ours. So the Army's construct today, and especially with the geography and the terrain in the northern sectors as well, the movement or the battle space which the Indian Army looks at is a relatively narrow one, 20, 30 odd kilometers. Whereas when you go into a war or a conflict in another country and with the greater political objectives, how do you impact the other country's political will? By striking the other country deep into its own territory, into its heartland, striking its military infrastructure, its economic industrial infrastructure, its major communication nodes, data centers. So any offensive operations deep into the enemy territory is a role of the Indian Air Force. And that is a major role over and above its role of supporting and assisting the other services. So when we look at a theater construct, which is probably a defensive in its approach, and with limited offensives, it clashes with the larger role of air power, which is fundamentally offensive in nature. So it's all about actually sorting out how do we do business together That is why probably the ex-army chief has recently made a statement when he talked about that we need to think things through, and rather than create the structure, first figure out how do we go about integration and war fighting, and then build the structure. And that's all the Air Force has been trying to say all along.
So, see, I was speaking to people in the Air Force, and they told me that it was also important to put this doctrine out, is because they want the country to know what the Air Force can actually do. In terms of the number of wars that India has fought, which is many, and all these wars have been something that has been fostered upon us by other countries, especially by Pakistan majorly, and then China. The Air Force has never really been used per se, in terms of its full capability. Has that been a mistake? How do you view that, sir?
Okay, we'll take a quick look at all the wars, and then it'll come out very clearly. Like 1947, the first war. Now, our senior leadership of the three services was still with the British. There were the British commanders. The supreme commanders were the British officers. And our political class were relatively young and new. It was a new country. Our Indian military leadership was also young in service. They were probably at a one-star rank level at best. So when the first war happened, the Air Force was small, but very few people are aware that in 1947, just beyond the Srinagar airlift, the Indian Air Force actually carried out a lot of offensive missions, a lot of interdiction and strike missions in the entire valley.
Achha.
And it also was an active player in the Poonch rescue. I mean, sort of for ensuring Poonch remains with us, and also the first flight into Leh, which was done by Baba Meher and General Thimaya on board. So, but the offensive part was not very well known. And in fact, I will say the Indian political leadership had probably a fairly sophisticated understanding of air power, because they wanted a cordon sanitaire where the Indian Air Force could operate up to 10 kilometers along the borders, striking the logistics and the supply routes of the adversary. But this was denied by the British. They turned it down simply because, A, they didn't want the war to escalate. They're probably looking at both India and Pakistan, both independent countries, then joining the the UK Commonwealth.
Yeah.
So they didn't want these two countries to go to war. So they actually restrained the Indian Air Force from operating, and all its squadrons, fighter squadrons, were not brought into operations. The same thing probably happened in 62, but 62 was a little different. There was a huge amount of air mobility and logistics which was carried out by the Indian Air Force. A huge amount of reconnaissance carried out across in the Tibetan region and in the northeast. But when it came to employment of offensive air power, we were sort of held back because of probably three reasons. One was an intelligence perception from the Intelligence Bureau, IB at that time, that any use of offensive air power would sort of invite a retaliation from the Chinese Air Force, which was actually unfounded given the altitudes of the Chinese airfields and their air force at that point in time. And the fact that the amount of recce missions we carried out into enemy territory and amount of airdrops we carried out in the border, there was not a single aerial response. That means the Chinese Air Force was actually not there. So, but this fear was brought in that Indian cities would be bombed. That was one. The other role, I think, was a major role played by John Kenneth Galbraith, who was the Indian ambassador, US ambassador to India, who did not want this war to escalate, because if you remember at that point in time, the PM had written to Kennedy, Jawaharlal Nehru had written to Kennedy asking for help, air support, US air support to be brought into India. And that is the time the US was very busy with its own crises at this time, at this point in time. And it did not want this, which would have forced them to come into India's aid. So that was another reason. So effectively, at the end of the day, offensive air power was not used, which was a pity, because the Indian Air Force had enormous experience in operating. We had just come out of the World War II, but operated extensively in the Burma campaign, in the typical jungle terrain, which is similar to the Northeast. And we really didn't participate there. And so this effectively led to the Indian, for the leadership to eschew the use of offensive air power, which I think was a mistake. While it probably, it would have certainly made a difference on the field. It would have certainly held back the Chinese in a major way. And we probably wouldn't have suffered the defeat that we did. In 65 is a little different. 65, you'll appreciate Pakistan had a huge amount of US aid coming in because it was a part of the CIATO and the CENTO, the two treaties, organizations which it was part of. So there was huge amount of military aid which is poured in. There's a whole lot of military aircraft, new aircraft which were supplied to the Pakistanis. And Indian Air Force has still not built up over a period of time at that point in time. It's still struggling to do so in the process. So when the 65 war happened, and also I must make it a point here that the connection between the Army and the Air Force in terms of towards joint operations was not so refined and sophisticated that it was, which became in the 71. So consequently, what happened was the Army fought the Army, the Air Force fought the Air Force. And the fact that we won the war in the end was a sort of huge victory for the country and just sort of erased the ghosts of the defeat of 1962.
Yeah.
But in 65, Indian Air Force, most people are not aware, about 40% of our Air Force was tied up in the East. It couldn't fight in the West because of, again, the fear that the China might intervene. So 40% of its assets were kept out of the fight. So this is again, and we were, the Indian Air Force was prevented of not encouraged to retaliate when in the East, the East Pakistani squadron of the Pakistani Air Force had attacked bases. And we were not allowed to retaliate and attack the Pakistani airfields till much later. So these were the constraints which were there up to 65. 71 was the truly only war, like you mentioned very rightly. It was a full-fledged use of air power, unfettered use. And we did a fantastic job there, absolutely with other services. All the three services came together beautifully to achieve the military objectives and the political goals. But in 99, which happened, again, we were not allowed to cross the line of control. So the operations were only in support of interdiction operations at high altitudes, which is the only war of its kind and only use of air power of its kind, and air defense. There was Pakistani Air Force in the airfield across in Scarborough, but they didn't come across simply because of the Indian Air Force operations in the terrain, air defense operations in the area. So the bottom line again is air power was constrained. So if you look at it, 50 years since 71 to now, and the history of restraining the Air Force or a restrained use or constrained use of air power is what has remained in the mind of the people and of the security establishment, possibly.
So one question that comes to my mind is, somebody, the former CDS General Bipin Rawat, the late CDS, who tragically died in a helicopter crash. He had famously said, and which caused much heartburn in the Air Force, that the Air Force is a supporting arm of the Army. And is this also something which this doctrine seeks to change? Because I've read through this document, and this talks about much more that the Air Force is capable of on an individual basis at the same time, not just with a joint doctrine, on an individual basis also.
Okay, God bless his soul, he was a fine man and the first CDS that we had. And he brought in a whole lot of innovative changes and some tough changes into the military. And at the end of the day, he was the first CDS that we have. And that is something which will never go away. Yes, probably that statement of his was something which came out not necessarily out of anything to put down another service, but more from a larger understanding which prevails. This is exactly the point I was trying to make, that the offensive role of air power, except in 71, and where it was actually really showed its effects was in the Western Front.
Not in the Eastern.
Not so much in the Eastern Front. Eastern Front, we gained air superiority, and rest thereafter, all the operations were in assistance of the. Whereas in the Western Front, it was very different. Indian Air Force carried out strategic missions on against. It was in fact the Air Chief Marshal P.C. Ral's innovative system strategy, where we attacked strategic systems like the energy system, the communication system. In fact, the attack on the energy system and the fuel system of Pakistan in fact, it is recorded in the Indian MOD history, which is out in the open domain and the book is available, that it actually, if that war had continued, it would have, the Pakistani war fighting machine would have probably come to a grinding halt because it would have run out of fuel. They were already importing fuel by road from Iran at this point in time. So the strategic effects which it had caused havoc into the communication system in Pakistan, road, railway networks. And it had attacked a whole lot of military infrastructure in depth. So what did it do? It effectively stymied, and apart from the three offensive thrusts, which it helped to stall from Poonch to Longewala, which were carried out by a significant strikes by the Indian Air Force, which affect so aside from those, by these depth strikes and the interdiction missions, it actually kept the load of the pressure off the front line in the Western Front. And Pakistan's stated strategy was that the defense of East Pakistan lay in the West. And the famous Tikka Khan's offensive never really came through. Absolutely. So the Air Force did play a major role, and this offensive role has been lost out over history in the national narrative and the more overwhelming security concerns we have had, which were at the border centric. So consequently, it led to the other services look at Indian Air Force purely from their meeting their requirement perspective, rather than the larger role that the Air Force has to play in the national security.
So one last question, we spoke about, the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war and the ongoing that we have with China at the LAC. Does the Air Force doctrine take into account the changed realities? You have the Russian Air Force, which is supposed to be the mighty Air Force, with a large number of their Sukhois and the MiGs and the fifth generation aircraft. But they've not really been able to really take on a small country, Ukraine. So does this doctrine also takes lessons from these incidents also?
Interestingly, the Air Force doctrine has been taking air power lessons, war fighting lessons from the world over, from its own operational experience and a large amount of experience gleaned from taking part in international air exercises, which the Air Force has been doing regularly.
Yeah.
On the Russia-Ukraine war, in fact, the war has been more of lessons of what not to do. And it underscores the fact that probably the Indian Air Force doctrine has been robust all along. The fundamental reason why I say this is because this is a very important aspect you bring out. And I say this without any bias and without impinging into the need for greater integration. But unfortunately, two facts come out here. One, Russia and its use of air power is very different from the West. For it, the air power is a subset of its surface campaign. There are two major aspects it looks at. Air defense in the larger construct, because the threat to the Russian mainland is something which it's always been worried about. So it had its air defense force as a separate structure till probably 2000, if I'm not wrong, where the PVO Strani, which was the Russian air defense force, which had its own missiles, own fighters, and air defense system, independent air defense system, they chose to do away with this and merge it into a Russian aerospace force. But the problem is doctrinally and structurally, and this is something, because I have researched it, if anybody else goes a little bit in depth into the Russian structural aspects of its doctrine, one will realize very easily that the air power, it looks at air power purely to support its military campaigns on the surface in NATO area. So it doesn't have a construct where it uses air aggressively into the enemy territory. And that is exactly what has been playing out. So it didn't carry out an effective SEER campaign with any amount of intensity and persistence, which it should have. It does not have a concept of counter-air operations. Consequently, the small Ukrainian Air Force and its effective air defense managed to stay alive, survive with enormous agility, and kept this huge, mighty Russian Air Force at bay. So the Russia was now restrained to use only missiles in depth with varying different degrees of accuracy. Now you will argue that why can't they use more hypersonic missiles and more long-range cruise missiles? They are immensely expensive. You can't use them to take out every little target. And every country has only so much of them. So air power plays a major role in offensives. The other issue is that the Russian Operational Strategic Command is a better concept.
Yeah.
It brought in the Russian tactical aviation and divided it amongst the various operational theater commands or operational strategic commands is what they are called. And that has failed. The air power capabilities have not been leveraged in that. There is a huge amount of disconnect between the Army's air defense and the aerospace air defense, despite being under the command of the Russian commander of the theater. So these are aspects which we need to study much more in depth and detail so that we evolve whatever integrated construct that we make. You can call it theater command or whatever we call it. There is no denying the need for integration, but it must be unique and specific to India's requirements. So that is one major takeaway from the Russian war. Other aspect which comes out is the issue of the A2AD, the anti-access area denial, which China has invested hugely in its West and East China seas. And a form of it does exist in the Western Theater Command across the Tibet.
Yeah.
And how do we penetrate that? And that's something Indian Air Force has been acutely aware of. And that is why, the recent, the doctrine itself, when it talks about offensive air defense, integrated air defense, it is well on the ball on this. But you will appreciate it is not about capabilities, it's also about capacity. And capacity is something I will not go into because it's there in every domain, the declining numbers, which are critical, which will play an important role in the future wars. And that is something which probably our policy makers are acutely aware of. But the question is, how do we do it? Because unfortunately, you don't get fighter squadrons available like in the big bazaar, go and pick up a couple of squadrons. It takes a long time to bring them in and to integrate it into the Indian Air Force. So, but this doctrine on the whole, I think, brings across all these to the public. And it's important for everyone to read it because today I feel that every citizen, the military is not the sole keeper of the nation's security. It's a comprehensive national power which comes into play. And integration of bringing in all this together is very important in all our threats, the multi-domain threats that we have in the future. And that's why the Indian citizen must also be equally aware of the stakes of national security. And that is why this doctrine is very timely.
Well, thank you so much, sir, for speaking to the print, to our viewers. And viewers, just log on to the Indian Air Force website. The doctrine is uploaded there. You should, and as Air Marshal Choudhury said, you should go and take a look at the doctrine that has been put out by the Indian Air Force. You'll have a better understanding of how the Air Force does things. And at the same time, please do log on to the print also and read my story on the same. So thank you so much for speaking to the print, sir. Always a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Snehesh. A pleasure indeed from my side as well. Thank you.